Welcome to the next discussion within our webinar series. I'm your host, Jim Parker, and today we've gathered leading expertise from Connection and our partners at Accutech and Microsoft. Please welcome today Suresh Arora, Principal Cloud Architect at Connection, and Terry Story, the Chief Cloud Officer at Accutech, and Dale Kirby, a Principal Cloud Architect at Microsoft. Working together, we offer a range of expertise for today's session. To get started, let's briefly recap the previous webinar series. We learned that Connection is a major Microsoft partner with the highest level of competency as an Azure MSP expert, offering a range of cloud and professional services. We explored our innovative CSP Plus program, which offers a rich set of built-in services for customers within our Cloud Solution Provider program. We reviewed why customers move to the cloud, reviewing the strengths of Azure, touching upon best practices and architecture, governance and management. And we also talked about the power of applying Azure's adaptive cloud approach in your cloud strategy, including migration and hybrid cloud options. And an exploration of the powerful set of AI-centric capabilities within Azure. And then we wrapped it up talking about how Connection can help customers with all facets of consultation, design, and ongoing services. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at today's discussion. We're going to focus on several topics more broadly approached in the first webinar. Today, we'll capture the key aspects of hybrid cloud, Azure migration strategies, Azure VMware Services or AVS, adaptive cloud, and then we're going to drill down on today's focus topic, Azure Local. Now for Azure Local, we'll break out what is Azure Local, how Azure Local works, migrating to Azure Local, governance within Azure Local, and managing the entire infrastructure with Azure Arc. And then an interactive discussion addressing most of the common Azure Local questions. We hope you enjoy the discussion and walk away with a better understanding of this incredible technology. With a roadmap in mind, let's get started by looking at some of the foundational cloud solutions that support migration and modernization with the help of Suresh Arora. Suresh, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. As Jim stated, our focus for today is around Azure Local. But at a high level, we would like to discuss about addressing VMware license challenges and different viable solutions. Addressing VMware migrations, clients generally have three possible solutions to pick from. Azure VMware Solution. These solutions provide seamless migration, no re-architecting, and same operation consistency with no VMware license required. Yes, that's correct. VMware license is part of the solution offered by Microsoft as a complete package. Another possible path is native cloud solution, which also provide strategy toward modernization, leveraging PaaS-based services. The third option on your screen is Azure Local, which we are discussing today, which is cloud-connected, distributed infrastructure, hyperconverged architecture, where you can run all your VMs in container application, manage via Azure Arc, which brings Azure Control Plane to your on-premises environment and provide out-of-the-box operations and cloud feature functions. With that, let's jump right into Azure Local and learn more about this fantastic solution. So Azure Local is a distributed infrastructure solution previously known as Azure Stack HCI that extend Azure services to customer-owned infrastructure in customer-owned data centers, enabling the execution of virtual machines, containers, and select Azure services at distributed location with centralized management via Azure Portal enabled by Azure Arc. So Gartner defines distributed hybrid infrastructure known as DHI as offerings that deliver cloud-native infrastructure attributes which can be deployed and operated where customer prefers. Basically, that means in your data center at your edge, offerings that are software and are integrated hardware with a unified control plane, Based off a 2024 Gartner report for distributed hybrid infrastructure, Microsoft has been recognized as a leader for its ability to execute and completeness for distributed hybrid infrastructure. Azure Local enables organization to adopt a hybrid cloud approach, allowing organization to extend their Azure infrastructure to on-premises environment for better performance and scalability. Azure local instances are managed through Azure Portal, providing a single pane of glass for operations, management, and security. Organization can still leverage their Azure hybrid benefit for Windows and SQL, along with software assurance core license benefit for their Windows data center license to trade off their Azure local core licenses. And based off our study with our various clients, we have seen significant performance increase on Azure local solution as compared to Nutanix, VMware, Hyper-V, and this has resulted in lower hardware compute required to gain more savings. With that, I'm going to hand it off to my friend Dale Kirby to give more insight into Azure local offerings and what the solution can provide. Over to you, Dale.
Thank you, Suresh. So, if you've been following Microsoft announcements for the past few months or so, you may have heard us announce Azure Local at Ignite back in October 2024. And so, Azure Local is technically a new brand within Microsoft, but it represents an evolution of our Azure Stack line. And more specifically, the Azure Stack HCI product is now known as Azure Local. And so if you've used Azure Stack HCI, then technically you've already seen some of what Azure Local has to offer. However, with this announcement, we've also announced a number of new capabilities under the Azure Local platform, including the ability to deploy Linux, for example, on bare metal. There's also a new capability for fully disconnected operations, and there's also some new available hardware form factors that greatly expand the available offerings within Azure Local and also provide more cost-effective options for smaller deployments and smaller edge locations. So again, if you've used Azure Stack HCI before, then you'll be familiar with a lot of what Azure Local has to offer, but there's so much more that's built into the platform now. So let's go into a little bit more detail on what Azure Local has to offer. So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty details of the features and use cases, it's important to understand that Azure Local is part of Azure. It's really an extension of the Azure platform. And so you may know Azure as a planetary scale set of global infrastructure that can run a lot of different kinds of cloud workloads, whether that's virtual machines or Kubernetes or container-based applications or platform as a service offerings like SQL Database or Cosmos DB. Azure Arc is our tool within Azure to allow you to use Azure technology outside of the public cloud. So with Azure Arc, we can actually use Azure technologies like Defender, like Azure Monitor, and even like PaaS services on our own on-premises infrastructure. And this is all powered by Azure Arc, extending the power of Azure to your on-premises or edge infrastructure. Azure Local is a particular kind of this Arc-enabled infrastructure that's made by our amazing OEM partners. And with Azure Local, you effectively can purchase and provision first-party Microsoft-branded offering with Azure Arc in your own data center and in your own edge locations. And we call this approach of using Azure pretty much anywhere we need to, either in public cloud or in our own data centers or edge locations, an adaptive cloud approach. So with this approach, we see Azure as really your option to run wherever you need to. And with Azure Local, this allows you to run Azure outside of the public cloud. Azure Local specifically comes in a number of different form factors and offerings from a number of different OEM partners. And so you've got a pretty broad spectrum of use cases that you can apply this to, and we're going to get more into some specific use cases in just a second here. But you can see at the bottom, I've got a number of different options in terms of server profile and things like that. Of course, I've got different OEMs I can choose from. Within each of those, I've got various options on, compute to memory to storage and all these kinds of different things, along with my networking and all this that I can configure based on the specific workload that I've got. But once I've got that hardware in place, then once I can effectively onboard it to Azure using the Azure local process. And that is a very smooth and simple process. It can be managed all through Azure actually. And once that infrastructure is onboarded, it's treated as an Azure resource. And so even though it lives on premises and your data and your compute, and obviously your hardware stays on premises or in your edge locations, you can manage that infrastructure and the applications that run on top of it from the Azure portal and using Azure tools like Portal or CLI or what have you. So it really gives you an integrated way to build a cloud native solution that really runs anywhere. So when we think about some of the specific industries that have really seen a large uptake and adoption of this adaptive cloud approach, and specifically Azure Local, we can look at three particular industries: manufacturing, retail, and healthcare. Now, with these industries, along with others, I might add, we have a need for running modern solutions that are infused with AI and are able to leverage the power, that they're able to take advantage and interpret the vast amounts of data that different businesses and organizations are collecting and curating as part of their daily business. Being able to use that data effectively often requires real-time processing and a low latency approach, and use or applied use directly at the edge at the source of data. And this is particularly true for manufacturing, retail, and healthcare, where sensor telemetry on a manufacturing line, for example, is ingesting just huge volumes of data that provide insight into the manufacturing process. So in this kind of scenario, many companies are starting to deploy applications that run at the edge and that are able to process and ingest this vast volumes of data and perform AI workloads or other types of workloads on that data at the edge in real time before then sending that data to cloud for additional processing or additional analysis. And so this pattern is very common. I call this an edge to cloud data pipeline pattern. It's something we see in manufacturing and retail and healthcare, and we're starting to see more of that in fintech and education and SLG as well. And so with this pattern, we can develop a cloud solution that runs in Azure, but is able to span the edge to cloud span of control that we need to apply in these manufacturing or these retail scenarios. So the way that Azure Local works in one of these instances, let's say I'm a manufacturer and I've got a number of factory locations that I'm going through a modernization project to enhance my manufacturing operations with AI. And so as part of this, I need to deploy local infrastructure, local hardware to run the AI application. And so I may have done this as a pilot for a couple of factories, and now I'm ready to scale this out across all my factories. And so to do that, what I can do is use Azure Local as the infrastructure base. And with Azure Local, I can effectively send an Azure Local cluster, a set of hardware, to each factory, have that hardware racked, and then once that's racked, I use Azure to manage the rest of the configuration process. So that includes onboarding the hardware to Azure, standing up the operating system and getting it patched and secured, getting it monitored, and just part of your day-to-day, operational insight and excellence strategy so that you can get a good governance handle on this infrastructure. And then I can use Azure tools to actually push and manage the applications on that infrastructure. So where I started with the pilot with just one factory that was kind of going through this modernization process, I've now scaled this out using the power of Azure and automation and cloud, and of course Azure Local, to scale this out across all my factory stamps in an automated fashion. And it's Azure and Azure Local that's allowing me to do that at scale and in a really controlled rollout. And so that's really one of the real benefits of Azure Local, is we can treat our on-premises infrastructure like we do in cloud. And with that, it means infrastructure as code, it means automation, it means scalability, it means central visibility from a common control plane. And in that case, this is Azure. So when we look at some of the benefits of kind of having this deployed infrastructure from the cloud. You can actually see in the screenshot here what it looks like to deploy infrastructure. So with a couple of clicks, I can stand up a new Azure local cluster, including things like, the configuration that I'll be using that cluster with, and specific information about its network profile or its hardware, about its server configuration. And once that infrastructure is deployed, again, it's visible inside of Azure portal. And so across all of my distributed sites and my cloud infrastructure, I've got a common control plane and a common pane of glass to manage all of that infrastructure. So everything can be done from the Azure control plane. Because we've got this central visibility across all of our distributed locations, that also applies to things like monitoring, metrics, security, our security posture, our update posture for updating this infrastructure. And again, having that common control plane within Azure and being able to use tools like we see Azure Monitor here for actually monitoring the server infrastructure and this Azure local infrastructure is really just invaluable, because I don't have to have folks on site. I don't have to have multiple different stacks to manage multiple different sites, or I don't have silos of processes or people or information. It's all right there from that common pane of glass. So we can go even further with Azure Local. We've talked a lot about what I would call operational excellence and really kind of getting really good management and control and governance on my infrastructure from cloud to edge. That's the first step that I see, partners and customers taking with Azure and Azure Arc, and this adaptive cloud mindset is let me use Azure to get really good governance on my infrastructure, my span of control of all my IT and data estate. But we can go much further than that with Azure Arc and with the adaptive cloud approach, because we can also run Azure services on our on-premises infrastructure. So once we've onboarded this on-premises infrastructure like Azure Local to Azure, and I'm managing it and governing it using tools like Monitor and Defender and things like that, I can now go even further and run Azure native services on top of Azure Local. So that means being able to run tools like Azure Virtual Desktop for VDI infrastructure at the edge, or being able to run app or data services like SQL Managed Instance or App Service or Azure Functions in my edge locations. So coming back to that kind of paradigm we talked about earlier of building for cloud but running anywhere, this to me really gets to that core paradigm of the adaptive cloud approach. I want to build for cloud, but I don't want to actually always need to run in cloud. I need to run where my workload makes the most sense. Sometimes that's in cloud, sometimes that's not in cloud, and that's totally okay. We saw some specific examples of that with the industry examples we walked through. So to me, that's really part of the beauty of Azure Arc and the adaptive cloud approach, and specifically Azure Local, is we can build for cloud, we can run anywhere, and we can take advantage of all the kind of cutting edge and amazing AI technology and scale technology that's in the cloud without having to be constrained to running in Azure public or public cloud regions. So with that, I think I'm going to now turn it over to Terry, who's going to walk us through some more details and use cases with Azure Local.
Thanks, Dale. If you look at this slide in front of us, it really denotes that Azure Local enables a new and exciting paradigm shift, supporting a wider range of tested, validated devices from many OEMs, and is more than a hyper-converged solution compared to Azure ATI's predecessor, supporting automated deploy for connected and disconnected scenarios with small and larger form factor devices at the edge and data center. This will also support automated deploy of bare metal Azure Linux with managed Kubernetes on smaller, lower cost form factor devices at the edge, bringing the full power of Azure at an affordable price to your edge and data center for virtual machines, container workloads, and a wider set of Azure services, essentially enabling Azure workloads such as Azure Virtual Desktop, Azure Kubernetes services, going beyond the standard Windows and Linux virtual machines, while enabling key services such as Azure AI and ML custom models on premise, which is currently in preview. Azure Local is one of the most secure solutions to date for the edge and data center from Microsoft, with AES 256 BitLocker encryption for the C drive and all data disks, providing secure data at rest. The solution also has over 300 security policies built in from the automated deployment with drift control, ensuring a consistent security baseline exists independent of Active Directory and Azure policies. Azure Local also supports secured core, ensuring all BIOS firmware and drivers installed are validated by the OEM and Microsoft. No other versions of the code are allowed, as not signed and approved, protected by WDAN, which is the Windows Defender Application Control. And then if you think about VMs, Microsoft are introducing this new capability called Trusted Launch VMs, which is currently in preview, enabling VTPM support and BitLocker encrypted storage within inside the VM, while also supporting live migration, leveraging the Azure attestation engine to ensure the VM adheres to expected measurements that has not changed since last boot. And lastly, from a security standpoint, confidential VMs are coming to Azure Local as well, taking security to the next level, providing encrypted memory, storage, and networking, bypassing the hypervisor, connecting directly to the processor's secure capabilities. Azure Migrate for VMware leverages the same tried and tested Azure Migrate product that is in use today with guided workflow. The main difference is, rather than migrate from on-premise to Azure, we're migrating from VMware to Azure Local, keeping all VMs and app data on premises. No VM Apple data goes to Azure. With the Azure Local LNet design in place for migration, and with two appliances deployed, one that connects to vCenter and discovers the VMware VMs and IP addresses, the second appliance connects to Azure Local Resource Bridge. As this looks like Azure to Azure Migrate, we can then configure ASR, the Azure Site Recovery Replication Engine, between the two environments and keep them in sync until we want to migrate each VM. The final step to instruct the shutdown of the VM, the source VM on VMware, and complete the final data replication, and then hydrate the VM in Azure Local, in the portal, under the resource bridge, while also updating the Microsoft on-premise cloud IP address and IP address in the portal, so we have a consistent end-to-end migration flow. So essentially, within the portal, within the RVM, we see the IP address and the IP configuration of the VM, and that matches to the actual VM. So we can migrate static IP addresses for not only Windows, but also for Linux machines. So some key takeaways with when we migrate from VMware to Azure Local. Azure Site Recovery can replicate all VMs from VMware to Azure Local and is independent of the version of OS, whether it's Linux or Windows. As I said, we can maintain the same static IP address for both Windows and Linux machines in the migration phase. And migration also supports DHCP-LNets and IP assignments. When we think about Azure Local and these new Azure AL services, the local AI search and Azure Machine Learning Catalog are enabled by Azure Arc, providing curated AI language and model services, deploying AI models on AKS running on Azure Local, enabling managed AI containers, video indexer, and edge AI search for RAG apps. For the Arc-enabled Azure machine learning scenario, this enables you to train and fine-tune AI models in public Azure and seamlessly deploy across cloud and edge. For the Azure Edge RAG app scenario, with language models and local data, this enables you to build Copilot-like experiences with on-premise data and local language models. The models supported are such as Gen AI, Pi3, Llama, traditional AI, and computer vision. So when we think about Azure Disconnected, this is currently in preview and is for enterprise agreement customers to sign up for. We can provide details of how to join that program. Now, why leverage Azure Local Disconnected? This is where regulatory constraints may exist that inhibit internet connectivity permanently and requires a complete air-gap solution. Alongside this core requirement, customers require a consistent Azure portal and operational tooling experience for Arc VMs and Arc AKS workloads compared to Azure Local Connected, providing a single operational model no matter if connected or disconnected. Now, not all features and capabilities will be supported with Disconnected and may never be, such as AVD, Cloud Defender, and Copilot. So please keep this in mind when choosing to implement a disconnected solution over the long term. Azure Local supports the same automated deployment for the infrastructure and Arc, VM, and AKS workloads. Lastly, as the slide denotes, the initial release of Azure Local Disconnected leverages the same Azure Local cluster to run the portal, infrastructure, and workloads all in. And this is an initial GA release. As we go further forward, then we'll see that the control plane and cluster will be able to be separated and to give you a more scale-out management model.
Well, thanks, Terry and Dale. In this next discussion, we gather from customers their most frequently asked questions, specifically regarding Azure Local. Now, this question and answer will save you a lot of time researching. And if you want more information, just contact your connection sales representative to get in touch with our team. Well, let's get going and start first with Terry. Terry, can Azure Local work at the data center as well as for the edge?
Absolutely, Jim. So Azure Local scales from 1 node to 60 nodes, supporting thousands of VMs within the cluster. And originally, Azure Stack Edge was designed from the data center, and the edge was introduced after that. And as overall Azure Local, it supports both edge and data center.
Well, why don't you take this next one, please, Terry? Can I migrate from VMware, Nutanix, and Hyper-V to Azure Local? And if so, what migration tooling is available?
Again, absolutely, Jim. So if we think about VMware and Hyper-V, Microsoft provides an Azure Migrate for VMware and Azure Migrate for Hyper-V to migrate VMs to Azure Local. So that's an automated tooling that's in preview today. Now, we think about Nutanix. Nutanix requires a third-party tool, and we look at Veeam for that. So Veeam allows you to back up a VM and restore that to a different hypervisor, Hyper-V, which runs on Azure Local, or is part of Azure Local. So absolutely, we can migrate from VMware, Nutanix, and Hyper-V to Azure Local.
Well, you're on a roll. Why don't you take the next one again, please, Terry? Do I need to replace top rack switches to deploy Azure Local at the edge and also at the data center?
This one's an interesting one, Jimmy. It comes up now very often. We have a lot of customers out there that have bought switches, 1, 3, 4 years ago, and they ask us, can we reuse our existing switches? And absolutely, because, if you think it from a pragmatic perspective, for customers to adopt Azure Local, they have to replace all their switches. It's not realistic. So we look at what that switch is, the capabilities. Is it in support? Is it an enterprise switch? And if it's an edge and we support switch lists at the edge, which means the storage and live migration go across the direct connect between network adapters rather than going to top rack switches, which means then the top rack switch is only required for TCP/IP, then absolutely in that simplified form, we work with the customer, integrate, and we support that deployment on the existing switches. Now, that said, we always recommend that customers look to the future and look to replace those switches with more validated and enterprise-type capabilities in the future when they are able to.
Suresh, let's talk about cost. Can I leverage existing Win Server and data service licenses and software assurance as well with Azure Local?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jim. A lot of our customer, when we talk to that, questions actually come up at the very beginning because of the cost, right? So customers can take advantage of their Azure hybrid use benefit on Azure Local, similar to what they will typically get moving to either native Azure or AVS solution. Also, they will get a full entitlement to Azure core licensing by leveraging software assurance for their existing Windows Data Center license.
Well, thank you. Take on a technical one, if you would, please. How about, does Azure Local support external storage?
Yes, currently Dell PowerFlex and Apex are two supported solutions out there, and Microsoft product team is continuously working with different other OEMs, and hopefully in next 2 quarters you will see different OEM solutions coming as a supported external storages as well. That's in the roadmap.
Thank you. Terry, this next one is for you. What is the replacement for VMware stretch clusters when you migrate to Azure Local?
Another good question, Jim. So if you think about VMware stretch clusters, they typically stretch across multiple rooms in the same building or close proximity data centers, less than a mile apart. And for Azure Local, Microsoft has developed a product called rack-aware cluster, which essentially is a close proximity cluster that takes a standard Azure local cluster, stretches the storage and networking across two locations. Typically, two data rooms in the same building, two data centers with less than a mile apart, with 1 millisecond return time and reasonable bandwidth support that replication of data. So absolutely, Microsoft are providing a replacement for VMware stretch clusters for customers that move to Azure Local, and that's called rack-aware clustering.
Dale and Terry, I think you should both take this next one together, please. Does Azure Local support microsegmentation and Azure Network Security Groups?
Yeah. So Azure Local is an extension of Azure. And so as such, we've got features built into Azure Local that allow you to use cloud concepts like virtual networks or network security groups within your Azure Local environment. And so that means you can build a micro-segmentation kind of strategy for separating your VM or your container-based workloads into discrete virtual networks that are segregated from each other. And this is what we would call micro-segmentation. So long story short, Azure Local does support virtualized and Azure Local network security groups, very similarly to how you would configure their Azure counterparts within Azure itself.
Terry, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great explanation, Dale. To add, if you think about your standard Azure Local deployment, in preview, the SDN is a one-line command line that enables you to install SDN, just about 20 minutes. And once it's installed, you can then go to the Azure portal and then associate LNets to your network security groups or create new LNets with newer security groups, allowing you to set up those access control lists to particular VMs and between VMs, creating that micro-segmentation architecture.
Thank you. Terry, let's talk about performance. How fast is Azure Local, particularly when you compare it to others of VMware and Nutanix?
It's a great question, and we get this quite often when we're migrating customers from VMware or Nutanix to Azure Local. Azure Local is very fast. The Spaces Direct architecture runs at ring 0, and with RDMA, Remote Direct Memory Access, the data that's exchanged between all nodes in the cluster is a memory-to-memory transfer. So removing the overheads of the TCP/IP stack within the OS. And when we compare VMware and Nutanix running on the same platform or the same hardware or configuration of hardware as Azure Local is typically twice as fast as VMware and 2.5 times faster than Nutanix.
Well, let's keep on the same subject. How much do I save when migrating from VMware or Nutanix to Azure Local?
A lot of money, Jim. So if you think about customers running VMware and Nutanix, they will also be running Windows Data Center and software assurance typically. So if we think about when we want to migrate the customers from VMware and Nutanix to Azure Local, we can reuse our existing Windows 2016 Data Center and software assurance license to enable hybrid benefit, which is 0 meters the cost of Azure Local. And if we remove the cost of VMware and Nutanix licenses from the equation, reuse the existing investment in data center and software assurance, that's a lot of savings. And if we think that the existing servers that are running VMware and Nutanix are 3 to 5 years of age and we're replacing those with more modern hardware, we can consolidate the amount of nodes required, reducing power and cooling and rack costs. Now, if we think about what else are the savings of running and migrating onto Azure Local, there's no client access licenses to pay for Windows Server because you're migrating those VMs to Azure Local. When you're in transition and migrating from VMware and Nutanix to Azure Local, Microsoft licenses for 180 days while you're in transition in that migration phase, so a lot of savings there. And if we think about extended security updates, these are free on Azure Local. So if you're running Windows Server 2012 R2 or SQL 2012 R2, they provide free extended security updates as part of extended security updates that come with Azure Local.
Interesting. Let's wrap up with you, Dale. Question 10. Does Azure Local support GovClouds and disconnected environments?
Yeah, so that's a good question. What I would say is that Azure Local is technically a non-regional service. So as I hope you've learned today, Azure Local runs in your edge or on-premises data center or physical location. So that means any applications or workloads that you run in Azure Local, their data and the application itself is going to be hosted and lives in your own environment. So it doesn't live in an Azure public region like US Virginia Gov, for example, or East US, to name a couple Azure regions. So having said that, there is some metadata about Azure Local that does get stored in an Azure region, and at this time, the Gov Clouds are not supported, but that doesn't prevent government customers technically from using Azure Local unless they have a specific requirement around where metadata is stored. And so we'd be happy to talk with customers that have that specific requirement, but long story short, does not support the Gov Clouds properly or officially, but that does not mean you cannot use it in Gov applications. As for disconnected environments, this is a feature that's supported now. It technically is in preview. So if you're interested in running Azure Local fully disconnected from the public cloud or from public internet, this would be an option for you. And there are some specific applications where internet connectivity is not an option. And so this disconnected option becomes one way of running on-premises infrastructure with a cloud paradigm. And so if you're interested in that, you can sign up for that preview to get started.
Let's bring it all together now with an example of how this looks in the real world. And Suresh, could you tell us a story of an Azure Local customer of ours that we've helped in this case and actually still helping?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jim. So we worked with a large truck automotive manufacturer where they were having issues with their performance, scalability, and huge, like a 5x uptick on their VMware cost. So bringing together public and hybrid cloud, Connection helped client to build a new digital manufacturing platform with a hybrid cloud architecture. It runs Azure Kubernetes Services, AKS, on top of Azure Local to take a full advantage of containerization running on premises and leveraging Azure Arc for a consistent management layer across its public and hybrid cloud environments. By leveraging this platform, client has recognized cost savings up to 86% and scalability to near time. And we are still working and exploring other options on running AVD and bringing Azure AI capabilities around to their Azure Local on-premises environment as well. So Connection provide variety of services like end-to-end offerings around Azure Local services to our customer. From assessing the current landscape, securing applicable funding from Microsoft, performing pilots or proof of concept to help you drive the value, the feature set comparison if you're coming out of Nutanix or VMware, like how you use automation today, what kind of tooling you have, and how it relates to running those workloads and applications in Azure Local, and further helping our customer with overall migration strategy, integration, ensuring they have a full depth and breadth of governance around it. And we also have a full suite of managed services. So in our managed services offering, we take care of any sort of proactive approach, patching, upgrades, those kind of thing, and it's a full breadth of managed services around it. So with that, I would hand it off to Jim to kind of provide us our top key takeaways for today's session and where we're gonna go next in coming few more webinars. Over to you, Jim.
Well, thanks, Suresh. We do always like to cap off things with a few key takeaways. First, Azure offers a complete hybrid cloud strategy. This is including AVS or Azure Virtual VMware Services, where you can lift and shift VMware into Azure without the worry or bother of VMware licensing. It's all included. We learned today how Azure Local is a viable, fast, and efficient option for managing hybrid cloud, including migrating from legacy cloud environments. And with Azure Arc, you can manage your entire hybrid architecture, including cloud, edge, and on-premises infrastructure. And of course, our team here at Connection wants to help you with any of this technology, from assessment, strategy, consultation, design, and implementation. This includes Azure Local, AVS, and native Azure. And last, please join us in the next webinar, where we'll discuss in detail Azure Data Analytics and Azure Data Fabric. It's a really exciting and timely subject matter for all of us to understand. So with that, we want to thank you for your time today and the excellent team of Terry, Dale, and Suresh. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you. you.